what have you learned from this, or what can we learn from this?
Well, I think there are a couple of things, right? So first of all, we need to recognize it's important to that bias exists. And in terms of dealing with bias, we should not come from an eradication perspective, because it's just going to fail, right? And that's what all the behavioral scientists and all these so-called experts refuse to acknowledge. And the reason why they refuse to acknowledge that is because there's some kind of allure around guilt. This self-flagellation, people want to immerse them. There's some kind of allure around it. But the reality is that there's an inevitability about bias. So coming from an eradication perspective is not really going to lead you anywhere good in a hurry, right? So what I encourage people, and what I talk about in my book, is to come from a navigation perspective. That is, how do we navigate it? It's like, do you do sailing? Have you ever sailed? Yeah, I haven't either, right? But I'm told by people that do it, right, it's very difficult. It's a tough sport. And there are certain constants there, like the rough waves, the wind, the rain, the snow, if it's snowing, right? These are there. There's nothing you can do about them. If you want to sail, you're going to have to deal with them. Unless you can call on celestial powers, you're not going to be able to get rid of them. But people still sail and they still get to their destination. And how do they do that? They navigate these factors. They navigate them. And we have to have the same approach with bias in terms of navigating bias. I would just say, in terms of giving something practical ways of looking at bias, there are two forms of bias. There's directional bias. Well, that's what I call it. Directional bias. That's when somebody's being biased towards me because of my race, because of my sexual orientation, because of my gender, and so on. That's directional bias. We have to work out how to deal with that. And then there is reverse bias, and this is the problem. Nobody wants to talk about reverse bias. There's reverse bias, where because of all the bad things and all the negative conditioning that I've had to deal with from people who are different from me, I assume that when anybody makes a bad decision who's different from me, maybe a white person, middle-class manager, who's different from me, makes a decision which is unfavorable to me, I assume that they're coming from a place of bias. Now, this is where it gets tricky. That's actually my bias. So now I become the perpetrator and they become the victim. But nobody wants to understand that. But that's the problem. And here's the worst thing, which compounds the situation. In that situation, I become the perpetrator, they become the victim. Neither of us call it out. So I think that they're coming from a place of bias, but I would never say that to them, right? But what I do is I look for somebody who looks like me and I'll tell them, which reinforces the bias about the majority. Now, the person who's the traditional perpetrator, I hope you're still with me.
Yeah.
The person who's the traditional perpetrator sees that I think that they're coming from a place of bias, but they don't tell me. What they do is look for somebody who looks like them, same ability level, or same color, or same sex. And they tell them, and they say, oh yeah, some of these black guys, they have like a chip on their shoulder, which reinforces that bias. And never the twain shall meet. So I'm saying, what if we could call it out? And the way to call it out is to simply say, I don't understand. We call this dispassionate developmental inquiry. Just come from a place of dispassionate developmental inquiry. Tell them that you don't understand. Now, there are many ways of doing that, and I go through that in my book, but that's essentially what you want to do. It's the purest, it's the most unscathed place that you could come from. And guess what? Here's the good news. When you come from a place of dispassionate developmental inquiry and you say some words to the effect of, look, I really don't understand, could you tell me the criteria for giving that project to somebody else, or what the criteria was for giving out that project? When you ask that question, it invokes the teaching or coach in the manager. And typically it's a manager, so it's the person who's senior that you're talking to. It invokes that. So they'll go, yeah, I'll show you. And then they'll start to talk about the decision that they made. And of course, within their explanation, the bias unearths itself. So you don't have to say that you told her, you gave the job to her and you didn't give it to me because of X, Y, and Z. Or you gave it to, you don't need to do all that. All you need to do is come from a place of dispassionate developmental inquiry, and you will invoke the teaching in the person. And the person will start to, well, I'll show you. And it also speaks to ego. Because some people say to me when I teach, they say, yeah, but our managers don't care. Our managers are hard-nosed. They don't care about our development. It really doesn't matter, because when you come from a place of dispassionate developmental inquiry to a person who's got a big ego, they'll want to justify their position. So again, they'll start saying, well, this is why I did this, and this is the criteria, and this is the criteria. And as long as you stay on the line of dispassionate developmental inquiry, go, I don't understand, right? As long as you stay on that line of questioning, what you're going to find is that they're going to talk more, and the bias will reveal itself. It will illuminate itself. And then it will become obvious to them. And then you can work collaboratively with them to try and sort it out, and you can hold them accountable for it. Does that make sense?